Let me start with the original. The President gave an interview to the New Yorker a couple of days ago, and he says the following. I would like each of you to refer later. Obama told me that in all three of his main initiatives in the region, with Iran, with Israel, and the Palestinians, with Syria, the odds of completing final treaties are less than 50-50. Everyone quoted it to this very moment, but nobody quoted the second half of this sentence. On the other hand, he said, and I quote, "In all three circumstances, we may be able to push the boulder partway up the hill and maybe stabilize it so it doesn't roll back on us. And all three are connected." This is a direct quote from the President. And here I want to start with you, Steve. You are back now in the White House, and the President puts the mission on your shoulders. Stop the boulder rolling down. What are your proposals on these three issues? Basically, I think it's called Plan B, but let's see what you come up with.
Well, I'll put something out there that I think the other four members of the panel will probably shoot at. But I think the President's, of course, right. They are related, and it really raises issues between the three negotiations of sequence and priority and strategy. And what I mean by that is, what is the approach to these three negotiations that makes each of them a positive for each other? That is to say, what is an approach that makes the three negotiations reinforcing of each other and using one to leverage the other rather than fratricidal, where one of these negotiations derails or disrupts the others? And I think the way to think about that, and the way I hope people in the White House are thinking about it, is while we would need to pursue and should pursue all three of them vigorously and within their own context, we should recognize that there is a logic between the three, and I would argue potentially a sensible sequence among the three. In a way, I think the Iranian negotiations in the near term are more strategically significant for both the United States and Israel because of the strategic threat that an Iran with a nuclear weapon would pose. I think, and I certainly wouldn't speak for him, but I think probably Prime Minister Netanyahu sees it that way as well. And therefore, I think there's going to be some reluctance on his part to conclude an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation until he knows where the Iranian nuclear negotiation comes out. Or probably he would say, I'm willing to take risk for peace in the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations, but not until I know that an existential threat to Israel in terms of Iran has been eliminated. And if there is a those negotiations, I think, have a priority. Now, there are these clocks on both of these negotiations. I think, and David and I were talking last night, I think there is a good chance the clock on the Iranian negotiations will slip, but I think in some sense the clock on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations will slip as well. If you get a framework agreement for negotiation, that still leaves a lot of time for negotiation before you get a final agreement. So the problem then, or the opportunity, is this. Let's assume there is a nuclear agreement with Iran. Then there is going to be a little concern, not more than a little concern, that an Iran out from under sanctions and out from under diplomatic isolation will be nonetheless free to pursue a hegemonic agenda in the Middle East. And that will need to be contained, and the United States and the U.S. will have to work together. The United States can and will do a lot in that respect in terms of containing a post-nuclear agreement Iran. I think this concern that the United States is somehow withdrawing from the region is way overdrawn. I think it's clear not just from the rhetoric of the president. I think it's clear from the commitment of John Kerry to the region and to the negotiations in this issue, and I think in this region, and I think it's clear from the actions that the United States is taking that could serve as a platform for checking Iranian hegemonic ambitions. The administration is getting more active in Iraq to deal with the al-Qaeda challenge, but it will also give the United States a platform in Iraq for checking some of Iranian influence. I think the president's made clear he wants to leave a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan post-2014. That will also serve to check Iranian activity there. The press reports that the administration is stepping up its efforts to equip and train a democratic opposition in Syria. That, again, will be used in part to check al-Qaeda, but it also checks Hezbollah and Iranian influence in Syria. And the administration has been strengthening their cooperation with friends and allies in the region. And there is a substantial U.S. presence in the region, as Secretary of Defense Hagel talked about in the Manama Dialogue and laid out in great detail. So this issue of worries about a post-nuclear agreement Iran free to pursue, in some sense, hegemonic agenda, I think is something that we can manage. But I think it's also an opportunity for Israel because it is clear that Israeli and Sunni state interests are increasingly aligning, and that means there is an opportunity for a quiet but closer tie between Israel and its Sunni neighbors. But I think the price of that cooperation may be Sunni state insistence that Israel reach an agreement with the Palestinians. And that is another reason, in addition to all the strategic reasons why Israel should pursue such an agreement, that is another reason why pursuing an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement would, I think, be very much in the Israeli interest. Now, some people I've talked to about this say, well, what if Prime Minister Netanyahu is not comfortable with the Iranian nuclear agreement and thinks it still presents some risks?
I'll come to it in a minute, if I may.
Good,
Steve,
please.
because I want to refer this question to Dennis.
Good.
Dennis, you wrote an article in Politico 3 days ago, basically on the Iranian issue. And you spoke about 5% enrichment as part of the final deal. We had Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday here. He repeated what he said about the agreement, the interim agreement, saying that it was a bad agreement. I didn't sense any willingness to accept any enrichment. How do you sell it to Netanyahu?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't expect the Prime Minister at this point to change his position from no enrichment to limited enrichment, if for no other reason than a fear he would have that whatever he says at this point becomes a starting point for negotiations, not their end point. If at the end of the day he might accept an Iran that had very limited enrichment capability with very intrusive verification means to ensure that you knew all the restrictions in fact could be verified, he might well be able to live with that, but if he says it now, his fear is he creates a slippery slope. So I'm not surprised that that would be his position. Now you're probably asking, so why am I making the case for limited enrichment? Look, it's not because I think from a non-proliferation standpoint an agreement that produces limited enrichment is the best outcome. It's not. Every country in this region will say whatever the Iranians get, we get too. And it would be better if there was no enrichment. But I think we also have to look at the reality that if you're going to produce a negotiated outcome, there's going to probably have to be at least limited enrichment. And let's also consider the significance of the United States maintaining what I would call leverage in the situation. If we want to intensify sanctions at some point. If we want to be able, if diplomacy fails, to use force and have the international community feel that the Iranians brought this on themselves, we have to put a proposal on the table that makes it clear that the Iranians had the ability to do limited amounts of enrichment, to take away any excuse that they would have. They say they want civil nuclear power. If we put a proposal on the table that says no enrichment, we're going to have very limited support from the rest of the international community and probably very limited support from the other members of the 5+1. If we put a proposal on the table that allows them to have limited enrichment, that will be seen as credible, that will be seen as plausible. If the Iranians turn that down, then what you've done is you've demonstrated what they're pursuing is a nuclear weapon, not civil nuclear power. Under those circumstances, we're in a much stronger position to be able to, as I said, put much more pressure on them. In the chance that, in fact, what they say is what they actually want, which is only civil nuclear power, then you'll actually get an agreement. In the event that you don't, then you're positioned, I think, both from a diplomatic standpoint and from a military standpoint to do more. And one last comment on this. We need to understand that diplomacy and the use of force are part of a continuum. The fact of the matter is, there is no military solution to the Iranian nuclear program. Whatever you destroy militarily, they can rebuild. So if, in the end, diplomacy fails and you have to use force, you need to be in a position where you can maintain the kind of pressure afterwards so they can't easily rebuild. If you have not put a credible proposal on the table, and to be credible, it's going to have at least limited enrichment, you're not going to be in a position to maintain that kind of pressure afterwards.
So you bet that at the end of the day, Netanyahu will accept a deal?
Well, I'm sure if you ask him that question today, he's not going to say yes. But if you ask me, you know, if there's an outcome where Iran has a very small number of centrifuges, you know, they have close to 20,000 now. When I say a small number, what I wrote in the piece was it's going to have to be less than 10% of what they have now, and they can't have next-generation centrifuges. It's not just numbers, it's quality. And they're going to have to ship out the enriched material out of the country. And they can't have a heavy water plant. All that has to be verified. This is what I called a rollback for a rollback deal. Not a cap for a cap, but a rollback for a rollback deal. You roll back the nuclear infrastructure that they have in return for the rollback of sanctions. It's going to be very hard to produce. When the president says 50-50 and at best, less than 50-50, and when the deputy foreign minister in Iran says that's probably high, they're probably both right. This is going to be very difficult to produce. But if you want to increase our leverage in producing it, then you have to be credible in terms of what you're prepared to put on the table.
Thanks. Itamar, there is an argument, and it will rage for a long time. Was the United States correct, or the president, not using force, not now, much earlier, a year after the whole thing started in Damascus and Syria generally? The president last night continued to adhere to the mission of getting rid of Assad, etc. What is part way, if I quote again Remnick in the New Yorker, what is part way from the U.S. point of view in dealing with Syria?
You know, we can spend quite some time looking back at the past 3 years and at the mistakes that were made. Let me mention one of them. Early on, Secretary Clinton and Director Petraeus wanted to be much more assertive and aggressive in Syria. They were vetoed by the president. The result is reinforcement of the position of the jihadi elements, and now you get into this argument that there is a jihadi danger, and so forth and so forth. But there's no point in dealing with water under the bridge. We need to look at what's feasible from now on. Now, I don't think that at any point a U.S. military intervention as such, boots on the ground, to use the cliche, was at issue. It was not required. And it's not required now. What is required is, first of all, trying to coordinate what different friends and allies of the United States do in Syria, now working at cross purposes. Turkey, Qatar, on one hand, Saudi Arabia, Jordan on the other, and so forth and so forth. You need to see a concerted action of what is known as, quote-unquote, friends of Syria. Number two, you have to empower the opposition. So there's not one recognizable name of an alternative to Assad. And you can do it not just by providing weapons, but by, let's say, inviting to Washington, giving somebody the dignity and the exposure of being invited to the 7th floor of the State Department, to the White House. Make sure that this is somebody that the United States sees as an alternative to Assad. And thirdly, to overcome the fear of weapons drifting to the wrong hands and actually empower, let's say, the relatively moderate secular part of the opposition, General Salim Idris, and that group. With these three elements, I think, you can have much stronger cards coming to the table. I agree. Ultimately, there is not going to be a military solution in Syria. Neither side can defeat the other. And in order to have a desirable political diplomatic solution, you need to have strong cards at the table, and this is what the United States can do in order to obtain them.
David, you wrote recently, and I quote, "The reality is that Obama needs to own his foreign policy. He needs to be more strategic and less political. He needs to set a vision and articulate it to allies and adversaries." What exactly do you mean in concrete terms on these three issues?
Well, in part I'm talking here about communication itself, not content, but the ability to project it, to send emissaries who will meet regularly with allies, who will communicate with adversaries in whatever way. To get at your question, what is the strategy that should be communicated, I want to go back to what Remnick quoted the president as saying about rolling the boulder halfway up. Because I think we're beginning to see now what the diplomatic technique of Secretary of State Kerry is, supported by the president, in two major negotiations, and then I'll briefly apply it to the third. And I'd call you, in diplomacy, to talk about the art of the possible. What Kerry is trying to perfect, I would call the art of the interim deal. He starts on diplomatic issues that people think are totally impossible. Forget it. There's no way you can get an Iran nuclear agreement. The Israeli-Palestinian problem, two sides are so far apart, he was just attacked for much of the first half of last year for even trying. He worked in secret on both issues, trying to narrow differences. And it's clear now with Iran, because we have the interim 6-month freeze agreement reached in Geneva in November, what the technique was. Take the elements you can agree on now, try to pull them together in a document, get that document agreed as a basis for negotiation of the broader comprehensive final status deal, even though you know that you're still very far apart on all of the relevant details of the final comprehensive agreement. I think he's doing the same thing now on the Palestinian issue. In the next several weeks, we may see a U.S. document, a framework agreement, an agreement on a framework. I mean, they're playing with words now, but it would have very limited items on which there's agreement, and then it would sketch the other areas to be discussed as part of the next stage, the post-interim comprehensive discussions. And I think that's the way Kerry is proceeding. So what would that mean for Syria? Because Syria is really the most difficult of these negotiations. If you say that's his method, what Kerry would seek to do working with Lavrov is to say, what are the elements we can agree on now with the Syrians so bitterly divided? Are there any lines of agreement, on humanitarian relief, on other items? My own feeling is that Syria basically is broken. It is cantonized. It is fractured. And that the only agreement you could get now, unless Assad is prepared to leave, in which case you could actually imagine a ceasefire. But if he won't leave, the things you could agree on now would have to be done within cantons, and you'd have agreements on safety, on transit of supplies, things that would stabilize the situation and reduce the killing. But the point I would make for you in this audience is, I think we're beginning to discern what the Kerry-Obama method is, and it's this art of the interim deal.
I'm coming to you, Dan. I'll give you a warning now. David says the reality is that Obama needs to own his foreign policy. Now, Kerry has been traveling to the Middle East, who knows how many times, you know, because you have to deal with it. But the feeling, at least that I have, and I think I'm sharing it with many Israelis, is that President Obama, forgive me, said to Kerry, go ahead, good luck to you, God be with you, and if you succeed, great. If you don't, fine. If I am the Prime Minister and I don't sense that Obama is behind it, and I read what Remnick is saying, quoting from Obama, that part of the way, do I have to take it seriously? There will be a paper, more or less on the lines that another journalist, Tom Friedman, gave the details this morning in the New York Times. We saw the details before, leaked by the Palestinians. And so the Israelis look at it, the Palestinians look at it. President Obama is not behind it, not in full force. And so they say, yes, we have 14 reservations, and the paper becomes another roadmap, another Clinton perimeters, etc., etc. Is that your sense?
Well, let me respond to a couple of things that have been said and get to your question. First of all, I think the notion of a divide between the President and the Secretary of State on the conduct of our foreign policy, of course, is not correct. That usually is encapsulated in the notion that somehow the United States is withdrawing from the Middle East. The President wants to pivot to Asia, has lost interest, and the evidence given for that is our ending of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps the decision not to use force during the chemical weapons events in Syria. The fact is those are inaccurate readings. I think one thing the President has been very clear about is that our ability to project power and protect our interests and be partners to our allies and confront our adversaries in this region was very much connected to our ending those wars, which were sapping our strength and keeping us pinned down rather than being able to focus on the broader regional threats. I think the achievement of the chemical weapons agreement in Syria was far greater than anything we could have achieved through the use of military force at the time that came out. And while we do have constraints, some are budgetary, some are simply recognizing the limits of our influence on every problem in a region that's going through historic convulsions. What's been very clear, and the President was explicit about this in his speech at the United Nations and in his speech at the State of the Union last night, is that the United States, under his leadership and executed by Secretary Kerry, remains deeply committed to our allies and partners in the region, the ones who share our interests and our values, obviously Israel with our commitment to security, our Gulf allies with our commitment to theirs, the troops and aircraft and missile defense systems we have in the region, and that we're going to be actively engaged through diplomacy and when necessary through sanctions and when necessary through military means to protect all of those interests. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. Secondly, I think I will agree with David's characterization of the Iran agreement and disagree in answering your question, Oded, about the discussions about a framework. It is true that what was achieved in the joint plan of action, the agreement reached on the first phase on the Iran nuclear deal, was, we don't use the term interim agreement, but it essentially was a first step. and it put some time on the clock. That was very important because we were dealing with a situation where had negotiations continued, even with the continuation of the very strong sanctions that we led and the world worked with us to impose on Iran, it was very likely that before those sanctions had their ultimate effect, Iran would have crossed certain technological thresholds which we would not want them to cross, because it's not in our interest. We're absolutely determined to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon. We share that view with Israel. We share that view with many other countries in the region. And this was a way of, in the first instance, agreeing on what could be agreed on, as David said, to roll back, freeze and roll back certain elements of the Iranian nuclear program, ending the 20% enrichment, actually ending that, removing that stockpile, reducing the number or limiting the number of centrifuges, very limitations on what could be done at the Arak heavy water reactor, very intrusive inspections and verifications, while we put time on the clock to negotiate toward a comprehensive deal. And we don't know if we'll be successful. We are going to give it every shot we have. We think it is far better to try to achieve that goal diplomatically than through other means, if not, but other means are available. In the first instance, additional sanctions are certainly possible after this 6 months are up, and the President has made very clear that the military options also remain very much available to him. I think the situation is somewhat different on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation. In this case, for one thing, we are dealing with a negotiation that in some respects is 20 years in the making. Dennis and Steve are among the veterans of previous administrations and even this administration that have really helped shape the outcomes and the choices that the leaders face at any time when you're going to face a serious negotiation on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So there's much less mystery about what an outcome looks like for this issue than there might be on the Iranian nuclear issue. The Secretary, with the President's full backing, has advanced the negotiations in the first instance by getting the parties to talk directly. And as we begin our work, or continue our work at this stage, to shape a framework proposal, it's very much drawn from ideas that the parties have put on the tables themselves. It's very little of it will be purely American authorship. There will certainly be a role for America to try to bridge some gaps, but much of what will emerge from that emerges from their discussions between themselves. And this framework, if it's going to be successful in giving us the time we need to negotiate a full peace agreement, is going to need to contain real decisions on all the core issues. And in that sense, this is where I disagree with David, it is not going to be as limited. It is not going to be an interim agreement. It is not going to be leaving as much to the imagination, although many details will need to be filled in, as is the case with the Iran agreement.
Thank you, Dan. Steve, if I may go back to you on the point you started to make. If you can turn and look at the map, it's me putting 4 question marks. In Egypt, the U.S. has a problem. With a short interruption of the Muslim Brothers, the generals continue to control Egypt. With Israel, 2014 will be a year of a test to the strength of the alliance or the relations on both Iran and the Palestinian issue. Turkey, who knows, the leadership is willing to consider buying Chinese systems. Saudi Arabia, there's not a single day when you don't hear some criticism from one person or another in high places in Riyadh about the disappointment from the United States. I think that 4 major allies of the past have these question marks. Do you accept it? And if you do, how do you rectify it, Steve?
I think that and if we show that we are prepared to continue to be active as we have for a number of administrations, I think that will go some way. Secondly, as I tried to describe yesterday, I think we need to come up with a set of principles, if you will, that will provide a touchstone for U.S. policy in all these various areas. Because I think, you know, if we get in the business of trying to pick winners, we lose. If we articulate principles about supporting tolerance, inclusiveness, rule of law, and democratic outcomes, and the efforts by people to achieve regimes based on those principles, we have a better policy. And third, I think, having success in these three negotiations. And I tried to describe how success in the Iranian negotiation might help and provide an opportunity on the Israeli-Palestinian. I'd like, if I could, say just one moment about how success in the Iranian nuclear agreement might affect the Syrian negotiation. I think under David's model, this negotiation, quote, is going to go on for a long time. I think they may get out of Geneva, too, some agreements about humanitarian assistance and the like, but resolving the fundamental underlying political problem of Assad is going to take a long time. Query, if we get an Iranian nuclear agreement, if in fact we are pressing Iran and Hezbollah in Syria by supporting the opposition, for example, whether there might come a point where the cost to Iran of their continued engagement in Syria becomes too high, and whether Rouhani has actually an incentive to change Iranian policy on Syria and to take the portfolio for that policy back from Soleimani and the Quds Force and the Republican Guards. I think that provides an interesting opportunity, particularly if Rouhani is serious about wanting to reconstruct his relations with the Sunni states. And I think there's a practical requirement as well, because when a nuclear agreement comes back to the U.S. Congress, they are not going to look just at the terms of the nuclear agreement. They're going to ask questions about what Iranian behavior in the region. And that may give Rouhani an incentive, and the U.S. an incentive, to try to work with Iran, and for Iran to work with the United States to help resolve Syria. Don't know. Just a question, just an opportunity. But I think trying to leverage these negotiations on each other is the key strategy insight we ought to try to be pursuing.
There are two states which I didn't mention yet. Itamar, what do you think is going to happen now with the spillover from Syria to Lebanon? And maybe I'll ask David the same question. What do we do? What is Israel supposed to do if there is a spillover, and there is a spillover, beginning at least, from Syria into Lebanon?
And I mean, there's a spillover from Syria into Lebanon and a torrent from Lebanon into Syria. I mean, Hezbollah does much of the fighting.
You're right.
Before I answer, I want to make a short comment on what Steve said and light a small red light. Clearly, I think a discussion began between the United States and Iran about regional issues beyond the strict nuclear issue, and it may end up well, but it may not end up well, and it certainly sends alarm bells among the Sunnis. Part of the Saudi anger that we see manifested in so many ways has to do with the sense that the United States may realign, is liable to realign its regional policies. So I'm just lighting that small red light. Now, with regard to Lebanon, we are actually dealing with an Arab world where large parts of the Arab world can be properly defined as failed states. The failed state is a state in which the government has no control or doesn't exercise real sovereignty over the full territory of the state. So clearly Syria is a failed state, Iraq is now a failed state, Yemen is, Libya is, Somalia is a member of the Arab League, not exactly an Arab state. And Lebanon is a failed state in the sense that an organization, non-state actor, Hezbollah, is more powerful than the state. Hezbollah demonstrated a couple of years ago that it could take over the state and chose not to do it, but the threat of their doing that at any given moment is there. So, and as long as Hezbollah is there in force with the rockets and with the military force, with the backing of Iran and with the, let's say, friendly neighbor to the east, this is going to remain the case. In 2005, the other camp was able to fill the streets of Beirut and actually force Syria out. It's not that long ago, but in 2005, the part of the Sunnis, the Maronites, the Druze, teamed up together and managed to have their own their version of an orange revolution. This is no longer the case. I mean, the other camp is divided. There's no one to take advantage of the bitterness that people feel about Hezbollah. The radical Sunnis are fighting back, mostly by exploding car bombs in the Dakhia. There is actually ongoing fighting in Tripoli between Alawites and radical Sunnis, and I expect that to continue. So one of the advantages of, call it, the moderate opposition victory in Syria, if that is to happen, is that it would weaken the position of Hezbollah and would enable us, the collective us, to start dealing with normalizing the state of Lebanon.
David, what is your proposal if things go sour in Jordan and in Lebanon, from the U.S. point of view? How should the United States deal? Because all of us, we are quite lucky to have stability in Jordan in the eye of the storm, if we may say that. But if things don't go as well as they do in Jordan and get worse in Lebanon?
Well, I think of Jordan as being something that Israel understands better than any other regional power, certainly better than the United States, and I think Israeli advice would be crucial in responding to disintegration in Jordan. Jordan is sort of sui generis. It's its own set of problems, and I'd like just for a moment to speak to the linkage between the situation in Syria and the situation in Lebanon. What the Iranians have to decide about Syria is whether, if it is not possible for Bashar al-Assad ever to rule the entirety of Syria again, and I believe that's so from my own travels inside Syria and everything that I hear and read, then is it in their interest to accept a cantonization of Syria in which their proxies have some cantons but not all? Are they more secure in that situation? And to be more precise, are their supply lines into Lebanon more secure? And you can make an argument that, in fact, they're much less secure, that they're much more vulnerable. Whenever Israel wants to strike at the corridor that leads from Damascus up to the Alawite heartland and passes by the Bekaa Valley and supply points for Hezbollah, Israel will be able to strike, and that's not in their interest. So you could easily imagine a situation where the Iranians would say, for our own self-interest, continuation of the status quo is undesirable. The word is, among people who follow Iraq, that Iran, interestingly, is in the process of looking for a new proxy other than Nouri al-Maliki to support in the Iraqi elections in April. Why? Because Nouri al-Maliki is seen as used up. You know, he is seen as a sectarian fighter. And the troubles in Fallujah and Ramadi are illustrations of that. And so the Iranians want another horse to ride. They're brilliant at this. When they decide one horse is exhausted, they switch. So I can see a similar process happening in Syria. I think it's much closer than some other analysts believe. A final comment about Lebanon. And it relates to this idea of interim agreements along the way toward real agreements. The civil war in Lebanon lasted, 15 years. The Taif agreement in, I believe it was 1989, only happened because all of the regional powers decided it was in their interest to have a stable government, relatively stable government in Lebanon. And I think the same is going to be true for Syria. So we'll have interim agreements on the way to the point at which there is a Taif-like agreement for Syria. And that, by definition, will involve Iran. I mean, you know, people were kind of patting themselves on the back for excluding Iran from the latest Geneva II round, and it probably isn't time for the Iranians to join yet, but you won't have any kind of stable agreement until they're there. And just the final thought, in Lebanon, Hezbollah is very strong militarily. I think they're quite weak politically now. And I think that their political weakness worries them. I'm a journalist, so I can go talk to Hezbollah whenever I like. And I've been struck the last several years by their consciousness of their political weakness.
Itamar, two fingers, okay.
Just a brief intervention. If we were looking for areas of convergence, one area on which certainly the United States and Russia could converge, possibly Iran, would be strict regime decapitation in Syria. Let's say if Assad and the immediate group around him leave and the rest of the nomenclatura of the Ba'ath stay, that is something certainly the Russians could live with, possibly the Iranians. I know that all efforts by the United States government to separate the Alawites from Assad failed in the past. If the Russians and the Iranians can deliver that, that could create an interesting possibility.
In a minute, Dennis. In the practice of the U.S.-Israeli relations, whenever there is such a junction when big decisions have to be made, there's an incentive package. Was there anything of this kind discussed between Israel and the United States in the context of this framework agreement?
I think we're, our incentives in many ways are built into this process. And they're incentives we provide, let's say, in an ongoing basis. They're not done as incentives, but they exist, and therefore, I think, can be drawn on as such. I mentioned our extraordinary security partnership and cooperation with Israel. It has expanded in really unprecedented ways in intelligence and military channels, in equipment such as the Joint Strike Fighter and the V-22 in recent years. All of that is as tangible evidence as one needs of the ongoing commitment to Israel's security. Now, in any two-state outcome, as the framework agreement we hope will chart, Israel's going to have to take some risky steps and going to have security arrangements that mitigate those risks. And I have no doubt that the combination of Israeli, Palestinian, Jordanian work together, involvement in an appropriate way by the United States, and technology and other elements can also be part of that agreement. But I think what's been so striking, and we heard it again from the Prime Minister last night, is he doesn't seem to me to need outside external incentives to try to proceed on these negotiations. He has identified the risk to Israel, the strategic necessity for Israel of achieving a two-state solution so that Israel doesn't have a binational state. He understands what that would mean for Israel internally. He understands what it would mean for Israel internationally. And he's determined and has been very clear about this point to try to reach a two-state solution. Wherever we can help shape that outcome so that both for Israel and, of course, for the Palestinians, who also are going to have to agree to it, it's something that they can manage, something that they know their core interests, and particularly for Israel, its security interests and recognition as a Jewish state are protected, we will do so. But at the end of the day, the incentive to proceed is not for external. It's because of the very nature of the conflict.
Thanks. Dennis, you wanted to make a comment before.
One quick comment on that, though.
But let me add another question so you can comment. I don't know if I'm revealing a secret. You're writing a book about Europe, Israel. There's a chapter on Europe and Israel in your book, next book. And I think, by the way, that we did not discuss enough Europe. in the context of this conference, but as always, next time. The EU came out with a package of incentives in the last meeting of the foreign ministers in December. Do you see a role for the EU in the context of some sort of an agreement between us and the Palestinians? And then you can add the comments that you wanted to make.
Okay, I'll make a few comments,
Okay.
but I'll start with your question. I think that the EU has always wanted to be seen as playing a diplomatic role and not just someone who provides a checkbook. I know when I was a negotiator, they used to complain to me all the time, how come you are not cutting us into the negotiations? And I said, look, if I want you in the negotiations and the parties don't, you're out. Okay? If I don't want you in the negotiations and they want you in, you're in. You make yourself relevant by proving that you have a role to play. The EU can do more, actually, with both sides to make themselves an indispensable player, and they haven't succeeded in doing that. Can they do more? Of course they can do more. They can do things with the Israelis. They can do things with the Palestinians. One of the things they can do with the Palestinians, when the Palestinians adopt positions that, in fact, are not reasonable, they can make it clear there's a consequence from the European standpoint, something they don't tend to do. They tend to do that with Israel, but they don't tend to do it with the Palestinians. If they did it with both, then they would probably have more credibility with both. I was going to add, Dan gave a very good answer, and one that he has to give sitting where he's sitting. Because I'm doing a book that looks at the whole history of the U.S.-Israeli relationship with a chapter on Europe thrown in, it is interesting that every single time there's been an agreement, we have produced a package for Israel. Every single time there's been an agreement where we have to cross or we're on the verge of crossing a threshold, we provide assurances. It's been a part of every negotiation ever since it began. And it goes back really to Camp David and then would be pre-Camp David, the Sinai II agreement with Kissinger. So that will come if there's an agreement. Dan's right. It isn't the incentive from the outside that's going to produce the agreement, but it's the assurances and incentives that can provide some of the rationalization after you've reached an agreement. On Itamar's point on the question of the Russians and the Iranians, both have always had what might be described as an instrumental view towards Assad. Now, since it's instrumental, it means when he's no longer an instrument, they can discard the instrument. But they've also decided that they have leverage in the situation by affecting the balance of power, and they continue to support him to affect the balance of power. Their readiness to decide to discard him will emerge when the balance of power changes or the cost of his being their instrument goes up too high. We internationally have not done enough to affect the balance of power, and until we do, they won't take that move. If we want to see a change in Syria, one of the things that's going to have to happen is to go beyond just the idea of the cantonization, and it's to provide the support to those who are doing the equivalent of what was the awakening in 2006, 2007 in Iraq. We're seeing it now for the first time in Syria. It gives us those who we could be supportive of within Syria, and it will affect the Iranian and the Russians. And in this particular case, if you want to strengthen Rouhani in the struggle with Soleimani, because today there's a bifurcation in terms of Iran's policy. Rouhani has a license to deal with nuclear diplomacy. He has no license to deal with Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Bahrain. That's Soleimani's domain. You want to change that, the cost of Soleimani's policies have to be seen as too high. We've seen with Rouhani's election and the fact that the Supreme Leader gives him a license that when the Supreme Leader decides the price is too high, he makes some adjustments. He's done some rebalancing. He gave a speech a few weeks ago where he even talked about some of the rebalancing on the economy where it wasn't so good for the Revolutionary Guard to be in control of so much of the economy. So if we want to affect their behavior in the non-nuclear area, just as we do in the nuclear area, here again you have to show the costs of the current pathway.
Thank you, Dennis. Steve, I'm enamored with my question marks, so I want to go back to them. Basically, let's deal with Saudi Arabia and Egypt, two different problems. The Saudis are really deeply concerned. And how do you rebuild the trust relations between Washington and Riyadh? Number one. Number two, Sisi, let's say that, what is his rank now? Field Marshal, Super Field Marshal, I don't remember, he was elevated a couple of days ago. Yeah. And he's elected for the sake of the conversation. And there will be some evidence of fraud, pressure, whatever, but he's elected. How do you deal with him? How do you rebuild the relations between Cairo and Washington, something in which we are very much interested and we are very much concerned with what seems to be some sort of a rift, current rift between Washington and Cairo?
I'll take them in reverse order, and others can jump in. On Egypt, you know, I think the paper says today, I think it was a deputy interior minister was killed yesterday, blown up in his car or office. You know, I think... sorry?
Stick to the microphone.
I thought I was. I'll echo what I said yesterday. I think that if the Egyptian military thinks they can simply reestablish order by cracking down and continuing to exclude people from the dialogue, it will not work, and demonstrations will increase and violence will go up. And what we have to do is engage with whoever is in power and rebuild our relationship with the Egyptian people by making it clear the principles for which we stand, and then engaging with the government and making it clear that it is not going to be able to reestablish security and economic prosperity in Egypt if it does not change course into a more inclusive direction that tries to resolve the political splits that are emerging in the country. That's the truth, and we're going to have to say that. Saudi Arabia, I think it's two things. One, it is rebuilding some of the personal relationships. It is fine for Secretary Kerry to go and visit the king, but they're concerned about the White House, and I think Susan Rice needs to go and spend a day in Saudi Arabia. I think so. You have to rebuild the personal relations. And secondly, we need to be consulting on these negotiations we have ongoing, have a sense of strategy that will lead to an outcome that is good for the United States and good for Saudi Arabia and good for Israel. And then third, we need to perform in a consistent way towards proceeding to execute those strategy and proceeding and achieving objectives. And I think there was something, I think Jack this morning said something, there's a lack of confidence in the ability of the United States to articulate an objective, set a strategy, and then execute it in order to achieve that objective. And that's what we've got to start showing in the region.
David, that may be the last question. I go back to your sentence, and I want to preface with a couple of figures. This has been a conference over Pew. So Pew had another poll a couple of weeks ago. 43% say the United States plays a less important and powerful role as a world leader. The U.S. is less powerful, as those who believe that, has increased 12% since 2009 and doubled since 2004. 70% of those polls say the United States is less respected than in the past. No, Americans. Pew poll. I think it's from November, never mind. So what does it matter? The president owns his foreign policy, doesn't own his foreign policy. You have an agreement on Iran, you don't have an agreement on Iran. To the American citizen, what does it matter?
Well, that poll was fascinating and worrisome in that it said that the consensus basis for strong U.S. foreign policy, especially in the Middle East, is shrinking. And I wrote a column about it. I said, this is the kind of evidence that in other situations leads you to call for a national commission with prominent American leaders, a sort of Baker-Hamilton commission or a 9/11 commission. The problem is that all the people who serve on those commissions are mostly in their 80s. And we have a younger America that looks at these wars of the last 10 years and shakes its head. And somehow, I think, the real task for people who care about U.S. foreign policy is to think about building a new consensus so we don't make the same mistakes in the next 10 years that we made in the last 10 years, and so that there's buy-in from younger Americans. And I think that's an urgent task. I really hope that's a big subject in our next presidential campaign. But those numbers, it's worth people who care about where the U.S. is to look at those numbers, because they say support for the kind of American foreign policy you're used to is shrinking.
Join me in thanking the panel. I think we had a very... Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.